Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy, where we're cheersing to forms of government.
Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy. My name is Andrea Vanessa Castillo. I am one of your hosts for today. I work as a program officer at a nonprofit organization called World Oregon, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Tim.
Hey, how's it going? Good to be here for another really interesting conversation about the world and how things function or sometimes don't. I know a lot of what we'll talk about tonight or today is governments, types of governments, how they function, how they don't function, and why they follow some general trend lines. I am, as I hope you know at this point, or depends on how you're listening to this, Tim Horgan. I am the executive director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Of course, the most important part of the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is talking about our drinks.
Yes.
I had a lot of fun doing some research for different types of governments that could become a cocktail. So there is a monarch martini, there is a Democrat, there are a lot of American bars that have made up a lot of various fun named cocktails in honor of our elections. But I went a little interesting here. And there is a story behind it that my research uncovered. And so I have the French 77, which is a drink that's some gin, some lemon juice, a little bit of champagne, some simple syrup. And you may ask why the French 77 for a program on types of government. Well, France, of course, has had a monarchy. They've had a dictator in Napoleon. They've had democracy in the French Revolution.
Right.
The French 77 is apparently named after a type of cannon that the French army developed prior to World War I. And in a bit of propaganda, they created a drink named after that to encourage the people of France to continue to live their lives despite the fact that the German army was about 90 miles away from Paris. So I think France has a lot of different types of governments that they've had over the years. So how about you, Andre? What did you bring?
That is so interesting. Like, how would you think that a cocktail would have so much history tied in into what it is? So I'm going to be honest, my drink that I have today is a little bit more on the simpler side, and you're going to have to follow me. This is not uncommon for me. My drinks, you kind of have to follow my stories a little bit. But I have just a regular schmegular vodka cran. And the reason is because today's topic, we're talking about forms of government, right? Governments, their main responsibility is enforcing the rules of societies, foreign affairs, economies, really driving how different societies function and engage with each other. And so while all of the roles of governments are kind of similar, the way that they're executed is so different. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And vodka is one of the most versatile types of alcohols. Depending on the type of cocktail that you are drinking, it could either highlight the taste, hide the taste. So the versatility of vodka is why I have it today. And so it might not be as direct of a correlation, but really just putting those pieces together is really why I have the vodka cran today. So thank you for following me.
And of course, vodka can be made from many different sources. It is a global drink for sure, and something that many countries will rally behind. You've got quite the plethora of options out there.
Yeah. And so speaking of plethora and options and varieties, I'm so excited today to introduce a good friend of mine, Mr. Djimet Dogo. And I want to have you introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us about who you are, what kind of work do you do, and share a little bit about the drink that you have with you today.
My name is Djimet Dogo. I am the director of Africa House and associate director of ERCO. ERCO stands for the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organizations. We resettle refugees in the state of Oregon, as well as providing other services that refugees need. I've been with ERCO for almost 25 years. We provide an area services to our new Portlander who are new here and calling Portland their home. I am also a human rights activist, fighting for human rights for the last 35 years. And that's the main reason that I end up here in the United States because of my work as a human rights activist, denouncing, since we're talking about, regime, denouncing dictatorial authoritarian regime. So again, my drink today is, I am originally from Chad, and I grew up in the Sahara Desert. So the common drink we have there is mostly green tea. Green tea is taken in the morning, breakfast, or dinner, lunch, with dates. Mostly you have 2-3 dates and 1 cup of green tea, you're good to go. So if you look at my car, I have like 10 or 12 empty cup of green tea because I use them and I never throw them. I just keep keeping them to reuse them. I love so much green tea.
I'm so excited to talk a little bit about the forms of government and to give kind of an overview to folks. When it comes to engaging in global conversations, understanding the world, what are the main things before we dive into each type of forms of government? What are some of the main pieces that folks would need to know when coming into a conversation about the types of governments that exist in the world?
So especially here in the United States, people have to know that not the whole world is like the United States. There is a different ruling system. There are places where people, have freedom to express themselves, as well as there are places that people do not have this right. You just a subject that have to be dictated what you need to do. In some places, you don't even own your own life. Your life is in somebody else's hand. So again, when people see things happen through the war, especially for American citizens, they need to know that the world is not like here in the United States. So people do things according to what exists in their home country. And when we are here in the United States, we look at some of the things that are happening all over the world. We look at sometimes maybe it's not acceptable, but those people don't know other choice. This is the only way of living that they have. And that it creates so much problem in the world. And today, if you look at people, leaving those areas, trying to migrate to Europe, trying to migrate to the United States, people are dying in the Atlantic, are dying in the Sahara Desert, are dying here at the Mexico border because of all those things that people are trying to escape from, to find things that is more suitable for them.
Of course, throughout this entire conversation, we must understand that there are varying degrees of whatever type of government we're talking about. But as you mentioned, many people are trying to enter into democratic states. So why don't we start there? And what are the general outlines for what is considered a democracy in 2024?
In general, what is considered democracy is when people have freedom to choose, freedom to express, freedom to have their opinion in the affair of the state or the government. People have to choose people that they want to represent them. In the system where there is term limit, people will serve their people and they are selected or appointed or voted in by their constituency or by their people. At certain point, even though you are democratically elected, you have your limitation. You have a limit. You cannot abuse this power. If you abuse the power, people who put you there can remove you. So in democratic system, you can voice your opinion even to the president, to the governor, to elected official, which is give an opportunity for people also to have a check and balance, to check on the people that they put it there so that those people will not abuse their power. And also there is more transparency in a democratic system where people will want to know where their contribution is going, where their tax are going. Elected officials or authority have the obligation to explain to the people what's going on with their taxes, why they're doing things the way they're doing. So there is accountability in a democratic system comparing to the other system in some places.
So, of course, that'll be most familiar to our American listeners. But one of the things that we see is a democratic backsliding across the globe. At the same time, you have many people and many authoritarian leaders who want to show that they're democratic, but it's really just for show. You see it in many different countries, and we don't need to name names at this point. But can you talk a little bit about that draw, that appeal of democracy for people around the world to the point in which even authoritarians want to at least pretend that they're democratic leaders?
Yes, especially in most countries, and particularly in African country. In 1990, after the collapse of the Wall of Berlin, a lot of European countries, especially France, during then President François Mitterrand, asking, the 14 African former French colony to start democratizing the regime, or they will not get assistance, they will not get financial support. And also the world, institution like UN, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and all those, they tie their support to a country who are trying to democratize the regime. So most of those countries give the impression that they are a democratic regime by allowing civil society organizations. I can give an example for my own country, Chad, for instance. In the 90s, after the collapse of the Wall of Berlin, there was a lot of pressure. There was a dictatorship regime. And so because the dictatorship regime of Hissène Habré doesn't want to change, so the France held positions to take over, which is President Deby comes and take over in December 1st, 1990, and declared that, okay, we are a democratic country, we're democratizing the regime, we're allowing the creation of civil society organization, opposition party, and all that. So we start getting support from the West, from international institutions, and all that. But in reality, all the civil society organizations who are created are facing some challenges. Opposition party, even though they allow opposition party to exist, but those opposition party are like a branch of the party in power. And then when there is elections, there is party who are real opposition were not allowed even to campaign. They create an obstacle in the way that the end result, the president win by 99.99%. Those are the things that many regimes, in the world will, especially in Africa, act like they're a democracy, but in reality, they're not a democracy. Some of them will put, their ethnic, their friends, just one clan or one tribe, and they are the one that are ruling the country, making decisions on behalf of millions of other people. And there is a lot of regimes that act like a democratic regime, but when you look at closely, they're oligarchy. People are appointed only if they share the same opinion with the people who have the power. And then you have a lot of, for instance, African country, soldiers, generals taking over. And then I said, okay, now we're going to democratize this country, but actually they just changed their suit, but they are all just the same thing, continue dictatorship. There are also countries, like you said early, sliding back. So you have a country like Myanmar who elected a politician in a free and fair election, but because this country used to be a dictatorship and oligarchy, those people who are pushed aside were not happy. So they have to remove the democratically elected person so that they can get back appointed their friend and all those general and turn this country again back into oligarchy so that the same people, same group of friends who share the same opinion continue to ruling the country. And if you look at the thing that are happening there, things are falling apart. There is a lot of armed group movement. There is a lot of people who rise against the general. And in the latest information, the army is losing ground because the population is not happy with what's happening because they made 2 or 3 steps forward toward democracy and now they're pushed back completely from a set point. So those are the challenges that we see all over the world.
Yeah, Jimmy, it's so interesting that when we are talking about democracy and just one form of government, we're able to introduce all these different types. And I want to dissect a little bit of some of the pieces that have come up in your answer. Like we've already talked about oligarchy and being able to say that that's a small group of people, having a control over a country, organization, piece of things. And we also mentioned authoritarianism. And I would love if we can talk a little bit about that. Like what constitutes an authoritarian government?
What constitutes an authoritarian government is that the power is highly concentrated in a group of people, that maintain political pressure on the rest of the people. Because Chad used to be an authoritarian government where any group or any opposition who challenge the government, there will be repression by armed forces. Armed forces were sent, entire village are burned down, people are being intimidated, people were pushed out into exile or detained, thrown in prison without a due process. So they create fear. They create fear. Some of those authoritarian regimes, they don't even respect their own constitution that they themselves wrote, because the president or the group of people who are running the country make the decision. They don't even care about the opinion of the people of the country. And at the same time, those authoritarian regimes hire some very powerful PR that work with the rest of the world, showing that they are in reality democracy because they allow few opposition party or civil society organization that share their opinion. But at the same time, there are repressions and people are thrown in jail and they create fear, especially they have a secret service that knows about everybody's life and intimidating people. So they create an atmosphere of fear in the way that people cannot raise to challenge those authoritarian regimes. And we live in my country like Chad during Hissène Habré, as well as during the late President Idriss Déby. When I was student at that time, so many students and human rights activists being killed for just raising their voice, organizing protests about some of those decisions that the government has taken. So those are the authoritarian regime where everything is controlled, ruled. Any opposition is repressed by force.
So then let's take it a step further. So we're talking about authoritarianism, forms of government. And so, a lot of the ways that we talk about democracy, would it be fair to say that opposite of democracy is dictatorship? And to be able to talk about what that is, how that looks like, and to be able to understand the concept of the freedom to choose and to really have that engagement with the government and who's representing you and different things like that. Can we talk a little bit about that piece?
In dictatorship, there may be a form of allowing people to represent themselves. But in reality, you have countries, even though you said not to mention some country, but I wanted to mention some country,
Go for it. As long as it's you doing it, we're all good.
Yeah.
I want to mention some countries. So you have a country like Rwanda, for instance. This country, military takes over, created democracy, but at the same time, because of what happened in Rwanda, Rwanda had a lot of support from international institutions to try to rebuild the country and all. So people see a relative peace, people see a lot of development, a lot of political position given to women, thing that is rare to see in African country. So when people, outside Rwanda, when we see this, we see Rwanda as a model, especially in Africa, as a country who is emerging from an authoritarian regime or from a chaos to a democratic system, because a lot of opposition, a lot of civil society organization, a lot of student protests are allowed. But at the same time, in reality, most opposition leaders who raise their voice are physically eliminated. Even if they're in other countries, you see the example of so many people who raise their voice, either they're in France, either they're in South Africa or Botswana or other African countries, were physically eliminated. But still, no international institution go after the regime, because most of the time the regime denied that they are not part of it. This thing happened, but everybody knows why those things are happening. And the president will change the constitution, say, okay, I'm not running again next year. And then when it's come to election time, he change the constitution, it's running again. So we keep repeating since 1994. It's the same president get reelected and all that. So it's confused people. You don't know if this is democracy. And at the same time, when people tend to raise their voice, they disappear, they're eliminated, and then all those, and it's created fear. So it creates confusion. Those are the kind of dictatorship that hide under the name of democracy. And then when the Western media, every time you can check Western media, when they raise this issue with the president of Rwanda, he always say, I don't have a lesson to get from United States or from the Europe. This is my country. We rule it according to the way we want it, the way that it functions. And that's create a problem because people now try to create a democracy, but the African way. So there is still some kind of authoritarians and oligarchy and all this mix into this kind of democracy. They let little bit of freedom, but 90% is authoritarians controlled by the people in power.
So, of course, with democracy, you can have multiple forms. You can have parliamentarian, you can have presidencies, etc., on down. You can also have many forms of authoritarian governments. And we've been talking about how many different governments want to at least have the appearance of democracy. My favorite, if we're naming names, is the Democratic Republic of Korea, the DPRK, which clearly is not a democracy, but okay. But one area or one type of authoritarian government that you don't usually see trying to pass themselves off as a democracy is a military-style authoritarian government, generally after a coup. As we've talked about in many of our podcasts, we've seen quite a few across the world in recent years. So can you talk a little bit about the differences and the reasons that many countries undergo coups, how long-standing they may or may not be, and what those kind of look like in form and function?
In Africa, for instance, one of the extreme authoritarian regime is Eritrea. And, most people see Eritrea as just a giant prison or detention center because there is no freedom of movement. People are forced conscript into army. We have so many professional people. People are trying to leave the country. Everything is controlled. And people are not only controlled in the country, there even those who are overseas in the diaspora are controlled because you still have your relative back there. And if you raise a voice or you go against the regime here in the United States or anywhere overseas, your family or your relative will be in trouble. So those are the form of total authoritarian regime that do not want even to allow the creation of opposition party. There is no opposition party. There is no civil society organization. There is nothing. Everything is ruled by those elite in power. They dictate, they do whatever they want. In many places, you have a president elected, wanted to change things, and then the next thing you see was overthrown by military. We have Al-Sisi, for instance, from Egypt, will come and say, okay, overthrown a democratic elected government using that, they are a Muslim Brotherhood. And because America and the West are against Muslim Brotherhood and anything Islamic fundamentalists and all those, they support the army to take over. And they said, okay, now we need to restart. We're going to create a democracy by the military. So now he became a civilian. But if you look at closely, it still is the military regime who dictate things. There is also during Gaddafi time, because as a human rights activist, I was invited by then President Gaddafi to help with the creation of Libyan human rights, charter. And what we saw there, because we are so many human rights activists that invited even from America and all those, but there is no constitutions in Libya. Everything is dictated by one person through the Green Book that he wrote. So the Green Book is the constitution. And this is a book that is written by only one person who sometimes does not even follow the Green Book. But at the same time, he creates an atmosphere of safety and security for the people. So people don't care. As long as they have a safety, as long as the economy is booming, everything is going well, they like the system. And now the West trying to change it, and the country went to a chaos. And now most Libyans say, well, how can we go back to this authoritarian regime under Gaddafi that we have, even though we don't have a freedom, but there is a safety, security, and economic booming and all those. So there is always those people who are dictators, who are authoritarian, they play very smart. with the people mindset as well as the international opinion mindset, giving the picture to the West or to the world that, hey, what are you talking about? We are a democracy. We have a people elected. We have given an opportunity to even minorities, and we change things. We change the constitution. But this is just to please the outside world. But in reality, there's no change.
And I think that's an important point because, as you said, the people, when they're living under a dictator like Gaddafi and they have safety and security and the economy is moving forward, they're happy. But I think it's the people who are surviving and prospering in that situation who are happy. I'm a Latin American sort of focused person, and so I think to the military dictatorships in Chile and Argentina who were dropping people out of helicopters for any number of reasons into the ocean. I'm not sure that those people were overly happy with their government at that time. So can you talk a little bit more about how people come to accept a dictatorship or an authoritarian leader, even if it is perhaps against their own freedoms and interests?
Well, as I said earlier, most of the time it's through fear and intimidations. People are forced to accept, even though they dislike, so you cannot raise your voice. I lived under an authoritarian regime and a dictatorship regime. You cannot trust anybody, including even your spouse. So the regime created an atmosphere of fear in the way that everybody is suspicious. Everybody reporting somebody. Your neighbor can report you as against the regime. People are so afraid to raising their voice, and they don't have any other option than to accept the regime. Because as I said earlier, any voice that is raised will be suppressed by force. You have a regime, authoritarian regime, does not even have a real national army, because what they have is Republican Guard, which is 99.99% the same tribe or same clan, and the national army is completely depleted, poor, ill-equipped, ill-trained, cannot raise to resist what's happening. But you have a Republican Guard, or they call it presidential guard, that is extremely well-armed, well-trained, and most of the time is well-equipped by the same country that we think they are democratic model of democracy in the Western world. You have United States, you have the Europe funding those kind of regime, especially in Chad, for instance. The Chadian oil is controlled by Halliburton and French companies. So as long as those powerful countries have their interests, they don't want to interfere in internal issues. And then the people, for instance, at Chad at that time, we cannot raise up. Who's going to help you? In order to raise, you need to have an external help, either with military training, with weapon, if you want to go through guerrilla warfare in order to go against the regime and all those. But there is no such support. People do not have such support. So people ending up accepting the totalitarian regime, the dictatorial regime, because there is no other options until the way they hope that something going to change one day. There are some cases where there are brave military soldier will decide to have a coup. But what happened, for instance, in Chad, there was a coup where Idriss Deby, the chief of staff of Hissène Habré, the dictator, was overthrown and opened up democracy, create civil society organization, and it turned out to be the same regime, just the name change. It turned out to be the same practice. So those are the challenges that in some country, people just give up their hope that there is no change because all the change is going to be the same thing. But there are some other changes in Africa. For instance, a country like Liberia initially was run by pretty much an oligarchy. People who are descendants of American slaves who moved to Liberia, they are well educated, they understand how government functions and all those. So they're the one that running the country. It's pretty much an oligarchy until some people decide to rise up and overthrow the regime and decide to change it and make it a democracy. And that's how things start moving because the majority of people, the natives said, no, we had enough, make some change. And that's how the oligarchy ended in Liberia.
As we're talking about individuals coming together, gathering groups of people to be able to look at what kinds of options there are when it comes to different types of governments, I would love to direct the conversation into another form of government. If we could talk a little bit about communist governments. Can you share a little bit about what constitutes a communist government? And I would love to also talk about the assumptions that are made, especially when introducing different types of institutions into the conversation, like socialism. So if we want to start first, just giving a broad overview about communist types of governments, and then maybe getting into a little bit more of the kind of social aspects of how folks receive information about it.
Yeah, because in a communist government, it's mostly the economic system where everything belongs to the creation, sharing of the resources of the country. It does not belong to the individual, like in capitalism, where private entity can run institution or run the economy and all those. In communist regime, everything that is created is owned by the community. So there is no one ownership, there is no private ownership. Everyone's supposed to share the wealth of the state or of the country. But because of what's going on, there is a few communist countries now in the world that still call themselves communist. We have like Cuba, China, Vietnam, and all those. Again, if you look at deep into communist regime, it's form of the top people who are running the country is just another oligarchy. The mass always suffering. The mass just get little bit tricked down to the mass. But the wealth is controlled by friends and relative or whatever, a small oligarchy that dictate everything. But they will tell you that everything that you have in this country is belong to you too. So we're going to share the wealth. But the wealth is not equitably shared. There are always people who are taking advantage of the system and just throwing the little bread to the mass who are suffering. Those people, they control pretty much the wealth of the country. When it's come to, for instance, socialism is mostly a system where the mean of production is owned by the community or by common. At the same time, it's controlled by the state or the government. But whatever produced by the government, if there is a struggle of the people are challenged and having the end meet, the government can intervene and help those people. It's not like in capitalism where you are on your own guard for everybody. In socialism, the government may intervene to help. It's mostly social ownership of the production of everything that's coming to the economy, in contrast to private ownership like we have in capitalism. But in most of the time, when you look at the communism and socialism, it look like pretty much the same thing. Which are the country, for instance, in the world where communists, you will have the same country. Where socialists, you will have again the same country because they're closely related. But there are some political party, even in Europe, that's called themselves like socialism. They want the state to intervene in the welfare of the people. And they create a socialist party where they want to take care of the vulnerable people in the community or in their country. In contrast to capitalism, where everybody on its own, try your best. In America, we said, pull yourself by your bootstrap. So if you don't have a boot in socialism, they will give you the boot so that you can pull yourself up. But in a capitalism, private ownership, if you don't have a boot, you are on your own. Figure out a way to find your boots.
Thank you so much for kind of breaking that down. We have about 5 minutes left. And up until this point, we've talked about democracies. We talked about authoritarian governments, dictatorships, oligarchies. We mentioned a little bit monarchies, and we started talking about a little bit of economic systems when diving into communist and socialist type governments. And so we've talked about some pretty big picture concepts. And I'm wondering, before we kind of wrap up today's episode, if there's anything that you would add on, like some final thoughts that you would wrap up this conversation with as we're thinking about what's important for folks to know about the different types of governments that exist in the world right now.
So one of the things that people need to know is that there is, as we said, there are a lot of type of government all over the world. For instance, in the United States, it's capitalism, it's democracy, and all those. But at the same time, each type of the government has its consequences. Sometimes too much freedom also create a chaos. And we have also at the same time too much authoritarian regime create also its own problem. Let's say you have a authoritarian extreme like monarchy. So you have like Great Britain, which is a constitutional monarchy, but the king or the queen has a very limited power. And at the same time, you have Saudi Arabia, who also is a monarchy, which has extreme rule. The monarch rule the country and everything, even the people and the country belong to the king and his family. So it's an absolute power. So the kingdom belongs to just one family that can dictate who lives, who dies, who can be expelled. So when some American, when they see it's a monarchy, sometimes they equate the monarchy in England with the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, which is a completely different. Right now, with the pressure of the war, the evolution thing are changing, especially with internet and all those people start posting things that are happening in some of those absolute monarchy, they start to change a little bit. So you have improvement of freedom of expressions, of freedom of movement, of women can drive, women can own a car, and those kind of things. And I have a friend of mine, he's a Saudi. Yesterday, he called me and he was saying, hey, guess what? We have our first liquor store open in Saudi Arabia. And he was so excited to celebrate it.
That is certainly not something that someone from the state of New Hampshire, where we have state-run liquor stores on pretty much every corner, would quite understand. But that's a perfect segue to my wrap-up trivia question. And this is both for you, Djimet, and Andrea. If either of you can get this right, I will be impressed. So there is one type of diarchy, so two heads of a monarchy, that exists in the world today. If you need, I can give you a hint that probably won't help that much. But the hint is that the two leaders are not hereditary leaders. They are ex officio leaders, which means whoever is elected to that position next is the diarch of this country. And those two people are the president of France and the bishop of Urgell, who is appointed by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Any thoughts on what country this could be? I wish we had the copyright to the Jeopardy music now. As our team, as our listeners are furiously Googling this question.
I know. I can hear our audience's keyboards calculating.
So the tiny, small, little country that no one ever remembers about.
Oh, hold on. Jimmy has a guess.
Oh, okay.
The tiny country?
It's a tiny country.
Is it in Asia?
No, it's in Europe. Squashed between France and Spain up in the mountains.
Andorra?
Andorra, that is right. They are the only existing diarchy in the world. So
I was about to say Bhutan.
Yeah. Yep. So that is your fun global trivia. If you take anything away from this, if you come to a World Affairs Council trivia at any point in time, you can awe and amaze all of your friends by knowing that Andorra is the only diarchy in the world. Well, Djimet, thank you so much for your time and your insights. We really appreciate it. I could have gone on for 2 more hours having this conversation, but as we always say, this is the start of the conversation, not the end of it, and we hope people will continue to take the time to better understand some of the different types of governments around the world, the positives, the negatives, the drawbacks, and understand that there is no one type, there is no one ruling way to move forward. But seeing as we are coming to the end of our podcast here, our tradition that we have created ourselves is to give a little toast at the end. So I will be toasting to democracy, of course. You can choose whatever form of government that you like personally, or just happen to like the name, like a kleptocracy, which is my favorite name for a government. I don't think I would want to live under that. So what we do is we'll do a little countdown, and then in the language of your choice, you can give a little toast to the form of government that you like the most. So if you are ready, 3, 2, 1, Sluncha. All right. Well, thank you very much, Djimet. This was a lot of fun. and really appreciate your time. And we'll see you during the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.